everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of America What the Fuck. My name is Chelsea, your current reporter for everything terrible in the United States, and not in bed with Vladimir Putin, unlike some other very important people in this country. I don't really have a lot to update personally or anything like that. I've been trying to keep the introduction of this podcast kind of lighthearted, but for the topic of this week's episode, it's kind of hard to make jokes. I think if you don't live in the United States, you kind of view us as a war zone, and you're really not wrong. Every single day, people die of gun violence in this country. School shootings have become a dime a dozen. It's gotten to the point where a lot of parents don't even want to send their kids to school. Children have to go to school with bulletproof shields in their backpacks, have to go through metal detectors in order to learn math. It's apocalyptic. Things feel pretty hopeless right now, and this topic, exceptionally hopeless. It's very unlikely that any federal gun control is coming in this country anytime soon. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's impossible. So, I thought I would spend this week's episode of America What the Fuck in going through the history of gun control in this country, because you might be surprised to learn that it hasn't always been doom and gloom. In fact, we used to have pretty stringent federal gun control in this country. As a general heads up, the topic of this episode is pretty upsetting. We're going to be talking about acts of gun violence and some pretty gruesome historical events. I will not be using the names of any shooters in this episode, no matter how famous or infamous they are. I really don't think those types of folks should be elevated more than necessary. So, if you find gun violence, death, or any of this particularly upsetting or triggering, this might not be the episode for you. Take care of yourselves when listening, and remember, I won't be offended if you skip this one. Anyway, let's get into the history. The history of gun control in this country begins all the way back in 1791. Not really, but a pretty important document was written and authorized during this time called the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution. And seeing as many, many people with "Don't Tread on Me" flags flying from the trucks that they don't actually need seem to think that the Second Amendment gives them the right to just carry AR 15s into Walmart, let's actually see what it says. On December 15th, 1791, 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which were eventually known as the Bill of Rights, were ratified. The Second Amendment, which is the star of this week's episode, says, quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." End quote. That's all the Second Amendment says. It's a pretty straightforward sentence, but as you will see through the duration of this episode, something that has been hotly contested. Nobody really passes any significant laws having to do with guns until 1934, which is when the first piece of national gun control legislation was passed. On June 26, 1934, the National Firearms Act, which was part of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, except this was part of his New Deal for crime. Anyway, the NFA was meant to curtail gangland crimes of the era, such as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which was a good old-fashioned gang fight between the Irish and the Italians in Chicago. We're not really going to go into huge detail as to what the NFA actually did, but just know that it was the product of its time. Prohibition, illegal liquor running, it was pretty much the gangs of New York. Anyway, the NFA imposed a tax on the manufacturing, selling, and transporting of firearms listed in the law. And in the law, it listed such weapons as short barrel shotguns and rifles, machine guns, firearm mufflers and silencers, the type of stuff that Irish and Italian gangsters were just carrying around back in the day. Just 4 years later, the Federal Firearms Act, the FFA, required gun manufacturers, importers, and dealers to obtain a federal firearms license. It also defined a group of people, which included convicted felons, who could not purchase guns and mandated that gun sellers keep customer records. Now, imagine that. A national firearm registry which requires people who sell guns to keep customer records. Just in case the person that you sell a gun to goes and does something awful with said gun, maybe you don't want to sell them a gun again. It's a crazy thought. And to me, it should mostly be common sense. But here we are. Just 1 year later, though, the landscape changed drastically. In 1939, the United States Supreme Court heard the case United States v. Miller, which ruled that through the National Firearms Act of 1934, Congress could regulate the interstate selling of a short barrel shotgun. Now, you might have heard that sentence and been like, okay, Congress can regulate the selling of weapons across state lines. This is the good old fashioned Commerce Clause at work. But SCOTUS takes it a step further. The court also stated that there was no evidence that a sawed off shotgun, and I'm going to quote here, has some reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well regulated militia, and thus we cannot say that the Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear such an instrument. Now, let's just dissect that sentence. The second part, the right to keep and bear, is directly from the Second Amendment. Now, the court does say that the people, i.e., the United States of America, does have the right to have a well-regulated militia. But the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia, that doesn't mean that you have the individual right to have a sawed-off shotgun or an individual right to bear arms in general. This obviously is going to change if you've been paying even an ounce of attention to the United States news cycle. But just know that it was once the law in the land, and it was the law of the land for almost 70 years, that you could not just have a shotgun or a gun lying around in your house, and it was not protected by the Constitution. On November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy and First Lady Jackie Kennedy boarded a 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible limousine to travel to a luncheon at the Dallas Trade Mart in Texas. There were a few other folks in the vehicle, including Secret Service Agent Bill Greer, who drove, Special Agent Roy Kellerman, who was in the front passenger seat, and Governor Connolly and his wife Nellie, who sat just forward the Kennedys. This motorcade was a meandering 10-mile route through Dallas, and it was designated to give President Kennedy maximum exposure to crowds by passing through the suburban section of Dallas. And the crowds absolutely loved it. They clamored to see the president and his lovely wife on that beautiful sunny day. John F. Kennedy's limousine entered Dealey Plaza at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Nellie Connolly turned and commented to President Kennedy, who was sitting behind her, "Mr. President, they can't make you believe now that there are not some in Dallas who love and appreciate you, can they?" Kennedy's reply, "No, they sure can't," were his last words. As the limousine continued down Elm Street, multiple shots were fired. Within 1 second of each other, Governor Connolly and Mrs. Kennedy turned abruptly from their left to their right. Connolly, who was an experienced hunter, immediately recognized the sound for what it was. President Kennedy was waving to the crowds on his right when a shot entered his upper back and exited his throat. He raised his elbows and clenched his fists in front of his face and neck, then leaned forward and leftward. Mrs. Kennedy, facing him, put her arms around him. As the limousine passed the grassy knoll, President Kennedy was struck a second time, this time directly to the head. After the headshot, Mrs. Kennedy began climbing into the limousine's trunk, and later, Mrs. Kennedy said that she had no recollection of doing so. After Mrs. Kennedy crawled back into her seat, both Governor and Mrs. Connolly heard her repeatedly saying, "They have killed my husband. I have his brains in my hand." At 12:38 p.m., President Kennedy arrived in the emergency room of Parkland Memorial Hospital. His personal physician, George Berkeley, immediately saw that survival was impossible even though the president was still breathing. John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 p.m., 30 minutes after the shooting. On Thursday, April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was staying in room 306 at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. At 6:01 p.m., Dr. King was standing on the balcony railing in front of room 306 and was speaking with Reverend Jesse Jackson when a single shot rang out. Dr. King was struck in the face by a single bullet fired from a Remington Model 760 rifle. The bullet entered through Dr. King's right cheek, breaking his jaw and several vertebrae as it traveled down his spinal cord, severing his jugular vein and major arteries before lodging in his shoulder. The force of the shot ripped Dr. King's necktie off. He fell backwards onto the balcony, unconscious. Dr. King was rushed to St. Joseph Hospital, where every attempt was made to save his life, but he never regained consciousness. He was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. On June 5th, 1968, presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy was shaking hands and greeting supporters at the Embassy Ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel in the Mid-Wilshire district of Los Angeles. At approximately 12:10 a.m., concluding his victory speech, Kennedy said, "So my thanks to all of you, and on to Chicago, and let's win there." Kennedy planned to walk through the ballroom after speaking his way to another gathering of supporters, but reporters, being reporters, wanted a press conference. As Kennedy was shaking hands with supporters and making his way out of the room, a shot fired out, and then another, and then another, and another. Kennedy fell to the floor. Others attempted to disarm the gunman as he was continuing to fire his gun in random directions. A plethora of people were injured. There's a famous image of Robert Kennedy laying there wounded with a man cradling and placing a rosary in his hand. At the time, Kennedy asked this gentleman, "Is everyone okay?" And the response was, "Yes, everyone's okay." Kennedy then turned away and said, "Everything's going to be okay." It took several minutes for medical attendants to arrive and lift Robert Kennedy onto a stretcher, which prompted him to whisper, "Don't lift me." Those were his last words. He lost consciousness shortly after. Despite multiple surgeries, including extensive neurosurgery to remove bullets and bone fragments from his brain, Robert F. Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1:44 a.m. on June 6, nearly 25 hours after the shooting. Following these three assassinations, President Lyndon B. Johnson pushed for the passage of the Gun Control Act of 1968. Overall, the bill banned importing guns that have no sporting purpose, imposed age restriction for the purchase of handguns, prohibited felons, the mentally ill, and others from purchasing guns, and required that all manufactured or imported guns have a serial number. In addition, the law also imposed stricter licensing and regulation on the firearms industry. You would think the assassination of three generally beloved people in the United States of America would cause people to pause and think. President John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. at the time were divisive people, especially Dr. King. It might not be a surprise today that they were assassinated for their political viewpoints and participating in the struggle, particularly Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King. However, hindsight is 2020. And at the time, these deaths shook and rattled the country to the core. It's kind of hard to believe that nowadays, given that the constant slaughter has almost become numbing. But we have to remember the fact that these incidents happened, and sometimes through public pressure, it does cause change, which is exactly what happened with the Gun Control Act of 1968. At the time, President Johnson hoped that by implementing these gun control measures, we would never have the carnage that occurred on those 3 dates. Regrettably, he was incorrect. In 1993, Congress passed the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, which was named after White House Press Secretary James Brady. Mr. Brady was permanently disabled from an injury suffered during an attempt to assassinate President Ronald Reagan. It was signed into law by President Clinton. The law, which amends the Gun Control Act, requires that background checks be completed before a gun is purchased from a licensed dealer, manufacturer, or importer. It also established the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, NICS, which is maintained by the FBI. Clinton did some other things too. Tucked and nestled into the sweeping and super fucking racist crime bill of 1994 is the subsection titled Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Use Protection Act. This mouthful is more shortly known as the assault weapons ban, which was a temporary prohibition in effect from September of 1994 to September of 2004 when it lapsed. In those 10 beautiful, glorious years, assault weapons were banned in the United States of America. And shockingly, gun violence went down. Multiple attempts to renew the ban have failed. Following the failure to re up the assault weapons ban, gun control kind of goes downhill from there. In 2005, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act was signed by President George W. Bush, everybody's favorite fucking war criminal, to prevent gun manufacturers from being named in federal or state civil suits by those who were victims of crimes involving guns made by that company. The first provision of this law is, quote, to prohibit causes of action against manufacturers, distributors, dealers, and importers of firearms or ammunition products and their trade associations. Now, this is kind of the backbone of the it's not guns, it's people argument. And hear me out. There's plenty of jurisprudence that allows people to sue the manufacturers of dangerous items, even when the item was not used technically as it was intended. The main one of them that I'm thinking about is the opioid epidemic. It's not so much about the misuse of the product, it's the marketing of it. It's giving dangerous things to people without adequately educating them on the safety of said object. The Sackler family advertised and doled out a ton of opiate medication, saying it wasn't addictive and that it was great. It purposefully advertised this in lower income neighborhoods and created an actual epidemic of addiction in the United States. The Supreme Court recently held, by the way, that they can't bankrupt their way out of settlements. Now, gun manufacturers don't say that guns are harmless. I mean, it's a fucking gun. The purpose of the gun is to shoot something. And if you shoot something, odds are high that it is either going to break or be seriously injured. However, manufacturing and pumping out propaganda of said weapons and misinformation about laws and required safety mechanisms that you have to put in place in order to prevent harm, that is something that the gun lobby and gun manufacturers absolutely do. There have been some headway into these lawsuits, particularly in Connecticut. But overall, it's really hard to get a meaningful settlement out of anybody when someone that you love dies of gun violence. This only gets worse in 2008 when the Supreme Court heard a case called District of Columbia v. Heller. Remember that case that we talked about at the beginning of this episode, US v. Miller? Well, Miller's ruling focused on the well regulated militia portion of the Second Amendment. Heller, on the other hand, focused on the individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia. The Heller case challenged the constitutionality of a 32-year-old handgun ban in Washington, D.C., and found, quote, the handgun ban and the trigger lock requirement as applied to self-defense violate the Second Amendment. So, Justice Scalia and D.C. v. Heller upended 70 years of precedent and said, no, actually, you do have the individual right to bear arms. And D.C. v. Heller has wreaked havoc across the country in terms of passing meaningful gun control federally and at the state level. While Heller does say that, quote, the court's opinion should not be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons or the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places such as schools or government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms, end quote. It also says that certain bans can't be done. You can't simply just outright ban a type of weapon. So the assault weapons ban is probably never going to be re-upped as long as DC versus Heller is still good law. And shocking to nobody except perhaps the late Justice Scalia, it was going to have some dire consequences. I live in Connecticut. I went to school in Connecticut, and I remember my first active shooter drill. I was in high school, post the days of Columbine, and while I knew that school shootings were a thing, they felt very removed from reality. I remember that I had to hide in a closet when I was 14, and I had to remain absolutely silent. The teacher drew down the blinds on the windows and showed us where we could hide, where if somebody looked through the glass on the classroom window, they couldn't see us. Most of us kind of treated it as a joke. I mean, I went to school in a rural area of Connecticut, and I went to school with a lot of kids who were farmers. People just had guns. And I didn't really think that it was anything weird for somebody to have a gun. One of my friends who I went to school with had guns in her house. And more often than not, her dad would shoot them. They were hunters. It didn't really seem like a weird thing. And it felt very unreal that anything like that could happen in Connecticut. On December 14th, 2012, a shooter entered Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. The shooter entered armed with his mother's Bushmaster rifle and 10 magazines with 30 rounds each. He managed to get into the school by shooting a glass panel next to the school's locked front door entrance. The principal, Don Hochsprung, and school psychologist Mary Sherlock were meeting with other faculty members when they heard but didn't recognize gunshots. Hochsprung, Sherlock, and lead teacher Natalie Hammond went into the hall to figure out what was going on and encountered the shooter. A faculty member who was at the meeting said that the three women yelled out, "Shooter, stay put," and likely saved a lot of lives that day. The janitor, Rick Thorne, yelled, "Put the gun down," and then immediately took off running down the hall to alert classrooms and teachers to hide the kids. The shooter killed both Don Hochsprung and Mary Sherlock in the hall. The shooter went through the classrooms methodically. In room 8, a first grade classroom, Lauren Rousseau, who was a substitute teacher, had herded all of her students to the back of the room and was trying to hide them in a bathroom. The shooter forced his way into the classroom. Rousseau, Rachel Davino, who was a behavioral therapist who had been employed for about a week at the school to work with a special needs student, and 15 students in room 8 were killed. Following the massacre in room 8, the shooter went to room 10. where the classroom's teacher, Victoria Lee Soto, had concealed some of the students in a closet or a bathroom, and some of the students were hiding underneath their desk. Soto was walking back to the classroom door to lock it when the shooter entered. Soto put herself between her students and the shooter, who then fatally shot her. In total, 28 people died on that day. 27 of them were killed at the school, including the shooter, and the shooter's mother was found dead in her home. On April 3rd, 2013, the Connecticut General Assembly passed a 139-page major gun control bill with broad bipartisan support. Governor Malloy signed the bill into law on the same day. The bill required universal background checks for all firearm purchases and a high-capacity magazine ban, banning the sale or purchase of ammunition magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds of ammunition, like those used in the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. It also created the first registry in the United States for dangerous weapon offenders and added over 100 types of guns to the state's assault weapons ban. Federally, legislation was introduced in the first session of the 113th Congress to include the assault weapons ban of 2013 and the Manchin-Toomey Amendment to expand background checks on gun purchases. Both of these pieces of legislation were defeated in the Senate on April 17th, 2013. There has been some meaningful improvement federally since that abject failure of responsibility in 2013. The Biden administration enacted the first ever Office for the Prevention of Gun Violence, and it's done a lot of really incredible work, or it did until the Trump administration got rid of it. The Trump administration also repealed every single executive order having to do with gun safety that the Biden administration had done because things are all but impossible to get through Congress, as nobody ever wants to talk about gun control and make things political when somebody dies. So we seem to be just trapped in this constant cycle hellscape. Despite the federal legislature's abdication of their responsibility to protect children in this country, Connecticut has not had a school shooting since Sandy Hook. I think as somebody who lives in Connecticut and lived in Connecticut at the time of the Sandy Hook shooting, I have a pretty different perspective on gun control, probably than the rest of the people in this country. Sandy Hook shifted something for me in terms of gun control. Maybe it's just the selfish realization that it can just happen so close to home. Or maybe it's the fact that the majority of the victims on that day were babies. But with every single school shooting that has happened since, I find myself gripped with both rage and this numbing disbelief that it feels like no one cares. But I promise you, people do. Organizations like Moms Demand in every town have made incredible strides statewide in order to enact gun control legislation on the state level and even the local level. Even though the federal government doesn't seem to give half a shit about whether or not our kids die, your neighbors do. And so I want to end today's episode with somebody else's words. One of the most memorable moments of President Barack Obama's tenure was Sandy Hook, which he called the worst day of his presidency. On the day of the shooting, he had a small statement, a small press conference, and I want to end today's episode with that. One, because I think it adequately sums up how people were feeling that day, but also two, there's a call to action here. Not everything is hopeless. And in order to protect our kids, we need to have these tough conversations on, yeah, the access to guns is a problem in this country. It's not just the people, it's the guns. And we have a lengthy, storied history of incredible, adequate gun control in this country that has really only been upended in the last 15 years. Correlation is not causation in a lot of things, but the data is pretty incredible that if you have strict gun control and you make it harder to get a gun, it is less likely that somebody will get hurt.
As a country, we have been through this too many times. Whether it's an elementary school in Newton or a shopping mall in Oregon or a temple in Wisconsin or a movie theater in Aurora or a street corner in Chicago, these neighborhoods are our neighborhoods and these children are our children. And we're going to have to come together and take meaningful action to prevent more tragedies like this, regardless of the politics. This evening, Michelle and I will do what I know every parent in America will do, which is hug our children a little tighter, and we'll tell them that we love them, and we'll remind each other how deeply we love one another. But there are families in Connecticut who cannot do that tonight, and they need all of us right now. In the hard days to come, that community needs us to be at our best as Americans, and I will do everything in my power as president to help. Because while nothing can fill the space of a lost child or loved one, all of us can extend a hand to those in need, to remind them that we are there for them, that we are praying for them, that the love they felt for those they lost endures not just in their memories, but also in ours. May God bless the memory of the victims. And in the words of Scripture, heal the brokenhearted and bind up their wounds.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of America What the Fuck. Remember to like, subscribe, and share wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you in 2 weeks. And remember, take care of yourselves.